they are.
Location fits into it. So the long and the short of it is.
Absolutely. How about at the end of the day, do you do anything? Like, I'm really fascinated by rituals and things like that.
So I think it's really important to be ethical and make sure you're paying them well above.
Welcome to the Rask Network. What you're about to hear and see is limited to general financial information only. Please be sure to speak to your financial planner or refer to our financial services guide available at rask.com.au/FSG before acting on the.
Hello and good evening, everyone. I think I've got my video playing in another background. There we go. Good evening and welcome to Rask Live for this week, where we're talking property and shares, and we've got Pete Wargent joining us. Many of you know Pete. You probably listened to him on the Australian Property Podcast. You've probably heard him on many other podcasts or on the telly or something like this. So we'll welcome Pete to the show in just a moment. But I can see there was a bet on how late we would be. Deepak says 12:08 to stay intact, or 6:08. Benny said 6:07 and Carlos 6:09. Well, Benny, you were closest, so ding, 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 6:06. Welcome to a Wednesday night live show. Lately, we've been doing during the day because it's suited the guests a bit more, but as fate would have it, Pete's in the UK at the moment, so this recording time is probably better for him, which is great, and it worked for me because I'm on the road here in Sydney, and it was easy just to sit here in the hotel room and talk with Pete about property and talk with you all about everything. So, Paul, I can see you've said you've missed Wednesday nights as well as Caroline. It just basically depends on the guests and when we can catch up with folks. So thank you for everyone being flexible the last few weeks. So let's flick into some slides before we welcome Pete to the show. So if you haven't already subscribed, what are you doing? Subscribe. As you would know, you can watch this live show on Twitter. You can watch it on LinkedIn, I think, Rask YouTube, Selfwealth YouTube, Australian Shareholders Association, on Facebook, wherever you are watching, make sure that you hit subscribe. I notice a lot of people have subscribed to the Selfwealth YouTube channel, and a lot of people have subscribed to the Rask YouTube channel since we've begun doing these, over 20,000. So that's up to 4,000 or 5,000 in just a couple months. So it's amazing. So thank you everyone who has subscribed. You do get a notification if you click the subscribe button. You will get a notification when we go live, and we don't just do the Rask Live show on a Wednesday. We go live about 3 times a week for various things. One of the things is the business show on a Friday at midday. And sometimes we go live for the Australian Investors Podcast with Drew as well. So you'll get notifications from all of those things. So this week's joke, pretty easy one. I don't really like the wife jokes when it comes to dad jokes, but this one was pretty good. Just found out that my wife is getting me a universal remote for Christmas. That changes everything. That's my joke for this week. And it actually would be a pretty good thing because in my house, I'm constantly looking for my Samsung TV remote. And it is about the size of, I don't even know, it's probably the size of an index finger. And it's this tiny little remote. And the Groodle puppy has chewed up 3 of them. And they're $60 every time I've got to replace them. And it is a nightmare. So I would like some sort of universal remote that could control my TV, my air conditioner, everything all in one would be lovely. So yeah. Okay, there was no scores out of 10, so I'm guessing that it was a 10 out of 10. If you've got 3 minutes, could you please help us out and take the Rask Live survey? So some of you will know, some of you have already done it. We've had over 200 people do the survey, and basically this just helps us prioritize what you want to hear in 2024. So the survey coming through the chat right now, and I can see Rob's active in the chat. Rob from Selfwealth, giving me a 5 out of 10. That's not great, Rob, but thank you, sir. I will take that 5. Glass half full. So this survey is designed for you to give me feedback on some of the things that you want us to focus on, whether it's ASX shares, interviews, these types of things. The research and the kind of the notes that you give us will enable me to get more good, insightful guests and content to you in 2024. For example, one of the questions that we ask is, what's your biggest financial regret? And here's some of the real hard-hitting stuff. Number 1 says having kids with the wrong person. Well, that number 1 was not investing early enough. The other one was not buying Pro Medicus shares in its IPO. That would be pretty hectic. Getting married to an alcoholic, not investing earlier, wasting money in my 20s and not learning about finance earlier, not buying Bitcoin in 2014 when I found out about it through podcasts, not watching Rask before I invested. And then it goes on and it talks about all the other things that you wish you knew sooner. For example, here's 1 to 2 things you wish you learned earlier in life: how to invest early, healthy habits and mental health, to invest small amounts, how stocks work. If you put all this in there, what we're going to do is we're going to take everyone's basically responses. I'm going to read every single one of these and I'm going to draw common threads between them all and find strategies to help us focus more on the things that worked and avoid the things that didn't work. And I think that's kind of what we all want, right? So some people have said, what was your biggest financial success? Someone said divorce. Another one said putting more into super over the last few years, buying property at a young age, recently changing jobs and aggressively investing for the last 18 months, watching Rask, thank you very much, learning how to save and invest. I love this. So really, really good. If you haven't already filled in the survey, it does only take about 2 or 3 minutes. Of course, just in the Selfwealth platform. Please take a moment and give us a little bit of your time to do that. So we've got 2 episodes left for the rest of the year. Only 2 of Rask Live to go. We've got Pete tonight with us. We'll be talking about property and shares. I'm not a fan of the property or shares debate. I think it's pointless. I'll explain why in a moment. And then next week, we've got the Christmas special. I'll be bringing my hat, and I encourage you to do it as well. So g'day Goon, welcome mate, good to have you with us tonight. So there are a few goodies which I'll come back to at the end of the show with Pete. I think we've waited long enough to get Pete on air, so I'll turn off my screen and welcome Pete. Pete, g'day mate, how you doing?
Good evening. How's it going? Yeah, I was enjoying the betting on start time. Looks like the guys are across your usual late starts, but yeah, great to see everybody. And yeah, I saw Deepak's comment about the Premier League. Yeah, I have been following that. Unfortunately, Spurs haven't. Well, we've won 1 game in the last 5, so slowly sliding down the table, but otherwise all good.
Well, he started off really well, and Aussie coach, Aussie manager. That's pretty good. I'm a Chelsea boy, so I must admit that it's just kind of look away now every time I turn on the Premier League lately. But mate, glad to have you with us and glad for you to be joining us. I think it's early for you, if I'm not mistaken. So I know you've had to get up extra early for this, as well as the Australian Property Podcast, which you co-host with Chris Bates every Sunday morning. So if people want more feel of Pete, he's also on Twitter. He's got one of the most followed property handles in the country, Pete Wargent. So guys, what we're going to do is we're going to run through 3 slides that Pete's got for us, and then we'll just open the floor to Q&A. I might chime in with a few animal noises or sounds of acknowledgement when Pete says something that really hit me over the head. But basically, tonight is all about questions and answers, particularly around property and the share market. I mean, we talk about shares, we talk about Selfwealth and, you know, investing in index funds and ETFs all the time, managed funds, whatever. So, Pete, I might flick it over to you and you can just call out if you want me to go to the next slide or what have you. Now, these slides may be a little hard to see, so I'm going to try and zoom in a bit, but Pete's assured me that it's more the gist that we need to get. So, mate, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. Yeah, it definitely is. I think if your eyesight's anything like as bad as mine, you'll never read the specifics. But I think the principle is the important thing here rather than the exact numbers. So what this first slide is showing, I guess, is the benefits that people can get from long-term buy and hold investing in property. If you think about the number of people who've achieved a lot of success in property investing with no particular street smarts or anything like that, including a lot of politicians, you know, they've really just bought properties and held on to them for the long term. And I guess, yeah, it would be remiss of us not to throw in a Charlie Mungerism over the past week or so. And, you know, he would always say, never interrupt compounding unnecessarily. And I guess that's really what this graph shows. Now, if you sell property, there's a lot of transaction fees and costs involved. And when you buy, so you might pay 5% in stamp duty. Then you've got potentially, well, you've got legal fees to pay, building and pest inspections when you buy, but also when you sell, and that's what this graph is really showing, Well, if you were to actually sell post-tax, capital gains tax, like, it depends on your personal circumstances, but that's going to chew away, maybe 20% of your gains there. Now, there is a discount in Australia if you own an asset for longer than 12 months. But you can see from this, I mean, the principle here really is that some of the best results from real estate have often come from a buy and hold approach in high capital growth areas. So you're looking at assets with a high land to asset ratio, because you may have heard that phrase, that land appreciates and buildings depreciate. So it's usually the land that does the real heavy lifting for you, even though I guess the cost of building does go up over time in nominal terms. So I guess what this really suggests is focus on quality over quantity. I think a lot of property plans over the years, if you went back 20 years ago, it was all about volume, buy as many properties as you can, because the lending environment was very different. I think these days, most people, even sort of dedicated property investors, they might not own so many assets. So focus on quality over quantity. And I think the other thing here is that now the debt is generally inflated away over time. Now, there's not many sure bets in finance. When somebody says, it's almost a red flag if someone says, there's certainty about a particular outcome or particular investment. But that's one of the bets I do feel relatively comfortable with, that debt is inflated away over time. I think, there was the issue with Japan some decades ago. And since that time, I think if you look at most developed economies, there's a risk of high inflation, as some countries are finding out, like Argentina and Turkey. But there's very few countries in the developed world that are going to risk deflation. So I think you'd find that governments and central banks, they would literally drop money out of helicopters rather than see deflation. In fact, we've already seen this. You remember under the Gillard years, $900 payouts to people under a certain income. And people were spending it on slabs of VB and whatever. I guess what we've discovered over recent years is if you give people money, they will spend it. And therefore, deflation will always be countered by money printing, fiscal handouts. We've seen that again through the COVID period. So I guess, look, Australia has a 2.5% inflation target. So a 500K mortgage today, in 30 years' time, will probably it will feel like less than 250K in today's dollars. And that's at a 2.5% inflation rate. I guess what a lot of countries are discovering is there's plenty of upside risk sometimes to those inflation targets, including in Australia, actually, over the past couple of years. So that's all that graph is really showing, is that if you get compound growth working for you, so that's a consistent capital gain over time, you can achieve really good things. But buying and selling, I'm not saying don't do it. Sometimes there is a good argument for selling and reinvesting somewhere else, but you've got to acknowledge there's going to be capital gains tax, and there'll be other transaction fees when you buy and sell as well.
Interesting, Pete, that the same rules apply for shares and long-term investing. Almost like, well, it is. Buy well in the beginning and hold on to those good assets for, like you said, compounding effect. Goon, I did see that you came through with a question. Goon, you can ask all those questions and we will have time for them at the end. So please stay tuned, my friend. Alex, the stream has started. Just hit play. Please, we will have plenty of time for questions with Pete. Pete, I'm going to interrupt this slide for a moment. I'm going to ask you a question. You mentioned the idea of inflating away debt, and you used a word that I cannot remember how to pronounce. It was something like a triumvirate or something like this. I cannot remember what it was.
Say trio. If you can't say triumvirate, yes.
Say trio. There was a 3-factor thing that you mentioned on the Rask Roadshow, the recent event series that we did around Australia. And it kind of dawned on me why residential property, or property in general, is a very, very unique asset. And this is where I went wrong. Speaking of financial regrets in my life, this is where I went wrong. Can you explain what this means?
Yeah, so I guess, triumvirate, not an easy word to say if you've been drinking, but I was on the Diet Coke to the Rask Roadshow. So, really, I mean, trio is probably an easier word. So, yes, residential real estate in particular, it's a totally unique asset class because there's no other asset for which you can borrow in the same way. So the lending conditions that are unique to residential property, you can generally borrow a relatively low interest rates. Of course, they've gone up over the past 12 or 15 months. But generally, you can borrow at relatively low rates because it's considered a low risk long-term investment. You can also borrow on very long loan terms. So you might get even 25 or a 30-year loan. That's pretty unusual. Most often if you're investing, you won't get a loan for that kind of long loan period. In fact, a lot of people take out interest-only loans and extend those out almost in perpetuity. And the other thing that you get, which is kind of unique as well, is that there's no margin calls. So you can borrow at low rates for very long-term time periods, and also with no margin calls. I suppose the other thing that sort of comes with that as well is that you can borrow a relatively high loan-to-value ratio. So, for example, you might put down a 10 or 20% deposit only on a property, depending on your circumstances, and the bank provides the rest. So I guess if you add all that up, there's no other sort of investment where you can do that. Now, you can use leverage, of course. In the stock market, you can use margin loans. There's all kinds of different products these days, CFDs. You can invest in sort of ETFs that are themselves leveraged, or companies that are leveraged, but you won't find any asset class where you get those lending conditions as they relate to residential property. So usually what that means is that, I guess if you're early in the journey and you have a long runway, then you don't need to be too fearful of taking on some leverage. Now, actually, I was interested to read in a CNBC interview only a month ago, Charlie Munger said if he didn't have external shareholders, they would have actually used leverage to create more wealth sooner, which is I was quite taken aback reading that, because, we've always heard, the Buffett quotes about, if you're smart, you don't need leverage, and if you're dumb, you definitely shouldn't use it, or whatever the quote was, and take a drink for quoting Uncle Warren. But I was quite surprised to read, even at the age of 99, Munger saying, well, look, if we didn't have other shareholders invested in our fund or in our business, then actually we would have used leverage to, and I guess there's, you can always have too much of a good thing. So you've got to do these things sensibly and don't borrow more than you can afford. But there's definitely some benefit there to using some leverage to sort of build a larger asset base sooner. And as you said, I guess generally speaking anyway, there'll be ups and downs through the cycle, but debt does get inflated away over time.
Okay. We've already got a few Charlie and Warren quotes in the mix, and I've even got one or two at the end, so don't worry about that, folks. You'll have a few more shots before the evening is done.
Even from beyond the grave. Yeah, we're still quoting Charlie, so
drink responsibly.
It's a good day.
So this chart, by the looks of it, Pete, just if I could summarize it, on the left-hand side, we've got a number of properties, which I think is this blue line stepping up, and then we've got property values on the right, and all the different properties down the bottom. And I just quickly, for those folks who don't know, so Pete is a buyer's agent, so he helps people find properties, particularly in Brisbane and Queensland, but he's also a property coach. Now, I only learned this recently, so I think he's okay with me saying it, but Pete actually works with people one-on-one and in group settings. So if you're interested in that, I did put a link in the show notes. Rask does not get anything for saying that, but I did want to highlight it because I think Pete is brilliant at what he does. So you can book in a chat with him there if you're interested after this call.
Thanks. I'll shout you a coffee next time I'm down in Melbourne. Thank you.
Okay. Who knows? By then it'll probably be cold again, so I'll definitely need a few. Okay, so this chart basically looks like it stacks property strategy on top of each other. So you've got different properties, buying them over time, and then the values here. So can you talk us through this?
Yeah, so if you look down in the legend at the bottom of that graph or graphic, I guess it's something that was rolled forward from years ago, where people used to say, right, you buy a property, then you take out the equity, and then you go again and again and again until you end up with a dozen properties or 15 properties. Now, I guess there's somebody who started out in a very different lending environment. I did go down that route, but I would say most people don't or can't build properties of 12 plus properties these days. And I guess the lending environment is different. There's a limit to how much debt most people can take on or should take on. And actually, if you look at the ATO statistics, they're not exact because some people own properties debt free and some people don't disclose and all this kind of thing. But I guess, there's probably about 20,000 landlords in Australia who have 6 properties or more. So, statistically, yes, a few people do it, but actually in a population of 27 million, it's not that many. But again, I think, this is okay. I think, I've reviewed, you mentioned property coaching. I've been doing that for about 12 years or so now. And I've obviously, as a result of that, I've reviewed hundreds of property portfolios, if not thousands. And usually the bulk of the really important results come from just a couple or a handful of the best investments anyway. It's the old 80-20 rule. So I guess, again, the numbers here aren't necessarily the most important thing, but the principle is, and that is, now, if there's a finite amount to how much debt you can take on, you need to make sure that the debt you do take on is absolutely performing for you to the best of its ability. So, I think people used to take a bit of a scattergun approach, particularly in the pre-2007 days, when you could more or less, if you could fog up a mirror, you could get a mortgage, and people would just, buy here, there, and everywhere. Well, these days that's not really viable, and I wouldn't recommend it anyway, because actually taking on multiple properties comes with its own headaches. You've got more tenants to deal with, you've got more property managers to deal with. You get repairs which tend to come along, like London buses. They'll probably all come along together. So yeah, I would say, for most people anyway, if you can invest in, a couple or a handful of high capital growth assets, the general principle here is that the equity you create can enable you to pull out some of the equity and invest in another property. Now, I mentioned on the previous slide, you can have too much of a good thing here, and you do need to do that prudently. And yeah, look, I guess here, what the graphic sort of implies is that you're using interest-only loans. Now, in Australia, most interest-only loans actually reset after 5 years to principal and interest and start paying down. So, potentially that graphic might look somewhat different depending on the structure you go down and so on. So we've assumed no amortization in this graphic. But again, the important thing here is the principle. Also, I just noticed in the legend there, self-managed super funds. Now, it is possible to actually do residential or commercial property in self-managed super funds. Most people don't. And obviously massive caveats and disclaimers here because, personal circumstances and all that. And there are some pros and cons to using your super fund for property. Look, some people in business do it. They might buy their premises, but most people will leave their super fund invested with a fund manager or in the stock market. But I just noticed there in the legend. But yeah, I suppose, again, here's the principle. Yeah, I mean, this assumes building a portfolio of, say, 6 properties over a longish period of time. And I guess it's, the general idea there is that you're using some leverage in the early part of the journey when you've got a long runway. And the important thing is to try and create some equity, because then that gives you choices. I think most people find in residential property that the rental returns aren't that great by the time they've covered their costs of borrowing and also the costs of property management, insurances, and sort of rates and repairs and other things. Actually, the rental returns are never going to get you there. But what creating equity does do is it gives you choices, and you can potentially then rotate later in the journey into the income producing asset classes, which might be, for people who love property, that might be commercial real estate like industrial property, or as all the Rask members would know, Australia's stock market is almost tailor-made for people wanting a passive income, because we've got relatively high dividend yields. We've got the dividend imputation system where you can get franking credits and so on. So I guess what property can really do is it can supercharge the journey in the early part by you using some leverage. And then later on, you've got all the choices in the world then of how you might convert that into a passive income.
Just to make this make sense for people. So there was a question, not make sense, but put it in context. So there was a few notes here. One of them was from Deepak. So you learned that it's shares and property on our show. I'm going to ask Pete that question in a second, but as a beginner investor, in which order should I take them on, stocks first or property first? I think the answer, and in this book, Deepak, I don't know if you've bought it, but this is relevant. There's a book here from a guy called Dave Gow. I don't know if he was interviewed on the Selfwealth podcast, Rob, but Dave has actually got 2 quotes on the front of his book, or 2 testimonials. One of them is from Pete Wargent, and the other one is from Owen Rask. So he chose
Good testimonials.
he chose one of those wisely. Definitely not me. But in this book, Dave talks about how he used his strategy, Deepak, on a limited budget, and he ran some numbers and basically just found that it doesn't really matter what you do, you just should do something. That's kind of like the guaranteed thing, is you should do something with your money. Now, I was going to show you something. I think we said it was 9 Deans Road, Pete. Yeah, so this is a property that a friend and I wanted to buy out in the eastern part of Melbourne. And I'm pretty sure it was on the market. We could have bought it for around about $240,000. So this was going back quite a few years. I think that's wrong, very wrong. I estimate that this property, which doesn't look much better today, by the way, is probably worth about $900,000. The mistake I made is that I put all of my money into shares, and I probably should have bought the property, because as Pete just said, the equity gives you options. So even if I just bought one property and it appreciated in value, at least then I could have redrawn the equity and invested in shares. And you can speak to your accountant about that and your financial advisor. But basically the way that works is you take what you've got in your equity in a property, and you can use that to invest in another property, as Pete just said. Alternatively, you could use that to invest in a business. You could use that to invest in the share market. And the key thing is the proportion that you take out, your accountant will be able to clarify this for you, may be tax deductible. So you've got tax deductible money that is then invested into hopefully an asset that plays a tax deductible income stream, like shares for franking credits, for example. Not tax deductible, but tax friendly. So effectively, you can use the property to give you leverage in other ways. And that's something that I missed when I was younger. I was just too busy trying to invest in all the different shares and whatever. Now, property could have gone the other way. This property could have probably, by the looks, actually fallen down, or as Shand was saying before, could have burnt down. To be honest, it's probably just land value in this thing anyway, which is what Pete was talking about. But the key there is kind of like, just do something. In my case, it's easy to say I regret this, but I probably would have at least put some of the money into property when I was younger and had that consistent income stream. Now, Pete,
I'll just throw in there, Owen, just with all the usual disclaimers and caveats, what a lot of people as property investors would do in terms of how they approach this, if they save as hard as they can to get their first investment property. And very often what people do, it's a very Australian thing actually, is set up their mortgage with an offset or a redraw facility. And then when they've got excess dollars left over at the end of the month, they might put money into that facility. So what that's doing is doing a few things. Firstly, it's building up your buffer. So that helps to reduce risk. It's effectively saving you money at the mortgage rate, which today might be 5 or 6%, almost like a guaranteed return. But it also gives you optionality. You mentioned, or we've mentioned on these webinars previously, the stock market can be quite volatile. Even in a bull market, you might get various periods where the market's down 10 or 15%, sometimes more. But if you've got a buffer built up there, which you can potentially call on, it also gives you some optionality. So, that's quite a common way that people go about this, is they get the investment property, they build up a buffer, which helps to reduce their risk. And when the stock market has its conniptions, as it does periodically, most years you'll get a drawdown period where the market's down a fair chunk. Well, then you might redeploy some of those funds into the stock market. Now, you did mention that if you're using borrowed funds, then that might be tax deductible, but that's one you need to make sure you clear off with your accountant, because it's the purpose of the loan that's the important thing.
Yeah, do it right. So always get advice. I spoke to someone at the Ladies Finance Club event in Melbourne last week, wonderful woman. She was saying that she did not get that right when she went to redraw and buy her investment property, and then went to buy shares. She just muddled up all the money in the same account, didn't document it, and it's just a mess. So get proper financial advice, or get a coach for property, and get a tax accountant that you can trust on your side who's done it before.
Yeah, you'll thank yourself later on, because trying to unpick it when you get it wrong is painful.
Yeah. So Plant One said, he's giving me some praise. He said, I did do it right. I managed to start a business and bought a Tesla. Yeah, but a Tesla is just a Commodore of 2026, Plant One. That's the thing that everyone misses. It's just you're just getting the Commodore of a few years' time. That's how popular they are, and everything's going to be electric in 10 years anyway. So it sounds glamorous, and it is a nice car. I love it, but yeah, it's interesting. There's an episode coming out, Plant One, on the Australian Investors Podcast with Kevin Fung, who's a senior analyst at Rask. It comes out between Christmas and New Year's, and he talks about he just went to China a few weeks ago, and he just came back, and he talks about there's so many electric vehicles, car companies in China that you've never even heard of. Like unless you've been to China, you've never heard of these companies, and they're just like Teslas, and they're just as impressive. So it's really interesting stuff. Just quickly, I wanted to mention something before. Sorry, Pete, before I get to your chart. There are REITs on the ASX. So here's inside the Selfwealth platform. There are REITs, and these are real estate investment trusts. So some people like this. I think this was the one that was maybe talked about by the Barefoot Investor, but there are others. You can invest in property securities. They're called property securities. This one's a real estate investment trust that owns some of the Bunnings warehouse properties. You can invest of those underlying. So you can get some exposure, and some people do that. What Pete and I am primarily referring to today is residential property, whereas this would be commercial properties. Okay, Pete, we've got your third and final chart here for us. And if I just quickly look at it, we've got property values down the side. We've got those 6 properties up the top here as before. We've got the number of properties, again, just iterated on the side. Purchase price in the orange. End of year market value in the green. And that's it. That's the chart.
Are we back on the first? No, we're right. There we go. So I guess, again here, the principle is the important thing, not the exact numbers. So we've talked about, if you're going to use leverage, then early in the journey is good when you have a long runway, and that potentially gives you choices down the track. I guess the final piece of the puzzle then is to try and put some numbers on this. Now, this is going to be different for every single person. My journey was in professional services. I was paying the top rate of tax by the age of 26. So I had tax problems, good problems, I guess you might say, paying too much tax. But my wife was also, she was more senior than me in the firm we worked for. So we were both paying the top rate of tax at a pretty young age. So painful in terms of a lot of tax to pay, but it did give us a lot of borrowing capacity. So this is where I guess the final piece of the puzzle then is to start applying it to your own situation, and also to try and work out, well, how much might be enough. Now, I guess one of the things that Dave Gow and other people talk about is ideas like the 4% rule, which basically gives you an idea of how much of a net worth might be enough to generate the passive income that you want from your investments later on in the journey. So for the sake of argument, if you want a passive income of 160K per annum, then you might need $4 million net worth post-tax. But for a lot of people, look, it might be less, it might be more. It all depends on your personal situation. So this is really taking the principles from the first couple of slides, is then saying, right, okay, well, this is my personal situation. If people are lower income earners, then their borrowing capacity will be less, and vice versa. But then, I guess the one thing that's really changed, particularly since 2014, with the introduction of APG 223, one of the regulatory guides, is that there's basically a limit to how much each person can borrow. The idea is to reduce risk in the system on a systemic basis. But as it applies to us as individuals, right, I've only got so much debt that I can take on. That number's finite. So what's the best way to use that and try and make those numbers apply to your own situation?
I remember when Chris Bates, mortgage broker, used to talk about this. He used to say like the amount of money that people could borrow. And what does he say now, Pete? It's like 5 times someone's income, thereabouts, something like that.
Yeah, look, it depends. There's different ways. I mean, so you've got the sort of different tiers of lending. So you've got the big 4 banks that might be somewhat conservative. Then you've got all the second tier lenders, which might be sort of, the Bank of Melbourne, Bank of Queensland, that kind of type of lender. Then also in Australia, you do have what's called non-bank lenders. So they don't take deposits. They're not deposit-taking institutions. And sometimes you can push the borrowing capacities further with some of those institutions. So look, it's not a hard and fast rule of thumb, and there's ways you can extend that if that's the route you want to go down. But as a rule of thumb, maybe 5 or 6 times your total income. But then, there's lots of nuances there in terms of how the bank might treat various streams of income. For example, rental income might be shaded or discounted somewhat. So, I would say if you, you touched on the important point there. Speak to an expert whose job it is to keep an eye on what's happening in the lending market, because they can cut through all of the noise for you. I mean, they sometimes say that property, it's a game of houses. It's a game of finance with houses in the middle. I guess that's the reality for a lot of people. So you almost need a borrowing strategy at the outset, really, to think, right, okay, well, if this is the maximum amount I'm likely to be able to borrow, what's the best way to go about it? How do I apply that to individual assets and properties and almost reverse engineer it?
Yeah, it's just so opaque. Like what some banks will do and some banks won't, and which banks will offer you good rates, which won't. It's just, I found that bizarre. Like, we come on here, we have to be so careful about answering someone's questions about if they want to spend $500 in an ETF or $5,000 inside Selfwealth or whatever. But then you can come on here and you can say, buy a property worth $1 million and go and do it now. It's a great idea. And it's just totally different. And then you don't know what the process is necessarily. So I think one of the things is that people should get advice, and particularly as you embark down this strategy, particularly as you involve leverage, the accountant, the mortgage broker, coach, and financial advisor. If you're going to do things like anything to do with super, you want to get financial advice. But what I see, Pete, happening, maybe you can reflect on this. I don't know if you see this a lot, but what I see happening is, like, when people can afford to take the risk, i.e. use a loan and that sort of stuff, that seems to be the case that it's most prudent when your earning capacity is strong, as you said. So younger in life, when you can save, hopefully as quick as you can, although we know that's not easy. There actually was a question, I might just touch on this. Goon said, with the cost of living at the moment, is there any free advice available? Absolutely, Goon. In Australia, we have the National Debt Helpline, but we also have free financial counsellors. They're wonderful. Like, they're actually incredible. They're probably more qualified than most financial professionals, to be honest. And they are, because they are financial professionals, they're incredible. So go and check out, just Google financial counselor. They're all free. So it's amazing. Anyway, so earlier in life, people can save and save and save and use their borrowing power really carefully to get that exposure to an asset class like property, buy good properties, and that's the question I'm going to ask you. And then as they go through life, they let that, as your charts show, they kind of let that equity expand over time and sometimes pay down the debt. And then they get to a point where they often then cycle out of property or start to blend other things in. So then they might start to add Aussie shares, US shares, maybe even bonds and cash and these types of things into the mix. And I think that is something that I'm going to do over the next few years, at least, is I'm going to start to engage the property side of my portfolio, if that's such a thing. Obviously, I've got a business, I've got shares and that sort of stuff, but property is kind of one of the things that I've neglected. I've just bought, I'm an owner occupier. So Rob from Selfwealth, Scott Pape is a financial counsellor now. Yeah. So I guess, Pete, is that, like, I guess the question there is, like, well, there are many, like, questions there and many disclaimers that we have, like asterisks. One of them is, and I can't remember if it was Deepak or someone else that asked this question a moment ago, is, like, how do you ensure that the first property is a good one? Like, what are you looking for? Just generally, I mean, it's a whole thing that you do, but what should people be looking for?
Yeah, I mean, most often people would take what's called a top-down approach. So they start with the state and then the city, and then narrow down onto the short list of suburbs and so on. I mean, one of the things, and there's a disclaimer you talk about in finance, that past results may not be reflected in future returns or so on. But I mean, you can certainly take a look at the sort of long-term capital growth performance in a lot of the landlocked capital city suburbs, and you'll find that the returns have been consistent compounders over decades, essentially. Now, I guess there are some markets where that's not the case. So, for example, in where I come from in the UK, some of the regional markets have been very much boom bust. You get a big boom and then prices unwind dramatically. In Australia, that's been most evident in mining towns where projects or a series of projects gets approved. So in the Pilbara or Gladstone or some of those markets, and then there's a big influx of people, as the project goes into the construction phase. Then it sort of the construction phase completes and it goes into the production phase, and all the stuff, the staffing is a lot lower for that phase. And then, the demand for property just ebbs away, and you get this sort of big overhang of newly built properties that take years and years to be absorbed. So I'd say that for most people, you want to try and stick to either the capital cities or what they call the peri-urban locations, which are, I guess, are the regional cities that are within a couple of hours striking distance of the capital city. So I guess if you're Victorian, so you'd look at, say, Geelong, Bendigo, Ballarat would be the main candidates down your way. In southeast Queensland, that would be Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, Toowoomba. New South Wales, Central Coast, Newcastle, which is actually where we're quite active. Also Wollongong and some of those markets to the west of Sydney as well, like Bowral and so on. So, I guess those would be a starting point. I'd say a lot of this is common sense, right? Generally, the landlocked suburbs where there's not loads of land available for a lease have tended to be consistent performers because the demand goes up over time and it puts pressure on land values. So anyway, a short answer to a long question. Try and look for a proven performance over a very long period of time, i.e. sort of 30 years or so.
Gurun just asked a great question. And Carlos, we can get to yours in a second as well. With the influx of immigration, is the Australian market overinflated? You wrote something for us, for our members, just this week, talking about the rate of immigration in Australia. What do you think?
Well, the rate of immigration will slow. It's a bit of it's a slight anomaly in terms of, it's really a function of how the last 2 or 3 years have gone, because immigration basically went to zero. In fact, we had 7 quarters in a row where population growth was more or less static. We haven't seen that for decades and decades in Australia. But then, of course, the borders reopened, the international students came back, working holiday makers, tourists, the permanent migration ramped up again. And the number of temporary visas went up by over 1 million. So, yes, the year-on-year growth in the population is extremely high at the moment. It's running at over 650,000. But we'll probably find next year that slows back just naturally, because the net growth in the number of international students, for example, will start to level off. And we'll probably find that population growth is running at somewhere around 400 to 450,000. It's still a lot, but it's not the sort of rampant growth that we've seen over the past year. Is the market overinflated? Yeah, it is in parts. Yeah, we've seen there's been very low levels of supply. Not many people have had the certainty to want to be able to sell. Some regional markets went through a mega price boom during the COVID period, because during the pandemic, there was this natural race for space and people moved outwards. A lot of the tree change markets saw prices near doubling. There are definitely parts of the market that are overinflated, and now interest rates that we've seen the cash rate target go from basically 0 to 4.35%. So there's some pain in the post actually in some parts of the country. So you do need to be a bit careful in terms of what you buy and where and how much you pay for it.
So and so basically it's markets within markets, right? Like you're buying a quality asset that's very. See, whereas if I go and buy BHP shares inside Selfwealth, and say Caroline goes and buys BHP shares inside Selfwealth, they're fungible, they're tradable, they're identical, they're the same thing. But 2 properties aren't the same. So it's not easy for us to say, well, this one's high quality and that one's, just by looking at a couple of photos. You've got to actually take into account a lot of different aspects, like the land value versus the property, the condition, the location, which way it's facing, how far is it from amenities. There's so many things to take into account. But basically what you're looking for are those high quality properties. Pete, in terms of, like, this chart that you showed us before had 6 properties on it. How many do you see clients sustainably having when you work with them? Is it 6 or is it less? Like, if you work with someone over 20 years, what would they typically get to?
Oh, this is totally dependent on circumstances. I've got clients who are full-time property developers who own dozens and dozens of properties. I would say for most people who work a PAYG type of employment, I think for a lot of people, a very common situation would be they aspire to owning their own home, so a place of residence, and maybe just a couple, 2 or 3 investment properties. That would be much more common than a situation where people own stacks and stacks of properties. But I would say, yeah, I mean, owning loads of properties, it might be a good thing that people like to brag about at barbecues, but it's not really, the number of properties is more or less irrelevant. What you're really looking for is the results. And I would very often rather see somebody with 2 or 3 high quality, high performing investments than just stacks of underperformers. Because I think, as somebody touched on in the questions there, if you've got quite often sort of disparate low value properties spread all over the place, you can have issues with tenants and repairs and vacancies and property management, and it can actually be more counterproductive. It's very time consuming and painful, whereas if you've got a couple of high performing assets, well, that tends to be a lot better. It goes back to what Richard Koch would say is the Pareto principle, or the 80-20 principle. That very often the vast bulk of the results just come from a handful of decisions. And I think that's the thing in property. The number of decisions that you make might be far fewer, but the ones that you do take are potentially more important. So it can be a largely inactive approach for a lot of people if they're taking a long-term view. But it does mean the decisions you do make, you've got to get them right.
For sure. So guys, we've probably got about 5 or so more minutes, so please get your questions in. If you want to catch Pete, you can find him on Twitter at Pete Wargent is the handle. Or you can catch him every week on the Australian Property Podcast. So I'll get that up maybe as a link. The Australian Property Podcast is a Rask podcast that we produce now. And it's amazing because we have Pete, Chris, and Amy who run it, and then I just kind of tag along in the background. But every Sunday, Pete and Chris do the top 3 stories of the week, but also answer questions and things like that. So it's not just the 4 of us. We have all of the country's top experts on there. We have financial advisors answering questions from their perspective on property, all sorts of stuff. So go and check that out. I only say that because we're going to run out of time. I can see Luke said g'day from Facebook. G'day over there, Luke. Good to have you with us. You can watch the show back on replay even if you are late, mate. So, okay, so Caroline asked a question. What are the pros and cons of buying an investment property with interest only versus principal and interest? How would using a company structure change the pros and cons? That's actually, I feel like that's a really good question for a mortgage broker, Caroline. Let me know if you don't know someone, because they'll be able to take into account your personal circumstances with regards to income in the company or outside. Maybe I'll just rephrase this real quick, Pete. You've been a property investor for a very long time. You have many properties yourself. Do you use mostly interest only on those, P&I? Like, how do you treat that?
Yeah, a mixture of both. I would say the reason people use interest-only mortgages is that 100%, therefore, the interest payments are tax deductible. So that's the benefit. It's very tax efficient. You're not wasting money having to pay back the bank, because it seems to a lot of investors a bit counterproductive. Why borrow money only to pay it back again? But there's obviously, as Owen said, there's various disclaimers here. For example, during the Banking Royal Commission, or actually when APRA had a crackdown on interest-only loans a few years ago, there was a 1% differential. So people were paying 1% more for interest-only mortgages or thereabouts. And it got to the point where it was like, well, actually, if I can borrow 1% less, it was actually just better to get a principal and interest loan, because it was becoming sort of self-defeating to get an interest-only loan only to pay more interest, right? So it does depend on the situation. In terms of the structure, I mean, companies are more popular in other parts of the world than in Australia for various reasons, which you'll find out when you speak to your accountant. Companies are quite popular in the UK for buying property. In Australia, less so, for a couple of reasons. They're really tax-related reasons related to negative gearing, also capital gains tax. Some people do use trust structures in Australia, but this really comes down to your personal circumstances. What the structures give you is asset protection, but the tax benefits are somewhat different for an individual versus a company, and that's why most people either use a trust or individual names. But that really, that's probably one to sort of cover off with your accountant or planner, because it does sort of go back to your personal situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I did put a link in there because Deepak asked for some questions, asked for what are some of the things to consider when on the lookout for a good mortgage broker. I put two things in there, Deepak. One is about how mortgage broking works, and the other one is the 5 questions you would ask a mortgage broker before you want to work with them. So check those out. Everyone knows this basically, but Chris is my mortgage broker, and the way I found him, I knew Chris because he was a financial planner turned mortgage broker, so I knew him, but I didn't want to. Chris doesn't know this. I didn't want to work with him because I didn't want to mix business with pleasure, or I didn't want to mix business with property, so to speak. But after failed attempts with 2 mortgage brokers who I thought were reasonable, and they said they were experienced, to be honest, my situation was different, Deepak, because I have a business, and I was just so quickly lumped into the too hard basket for mortgage brokers. And Chris was like, I called him on a Friday night. He was outside throwing the ball around with his kid or something, and he's like, "All right, how long have we got? How much money do you need? I'll go figure it out." And he was wonderful, his entire team. So that's why we partnered with Chris's business for that reason, because I've been through it and I know how horrible it can be. So Caroline, that's a good question. So can you switch to a principal and interest if the equity does increase and let the losses revert to the bank? So Caroline, Pete did mention that before on interest only loans. There are sometimes reset periods that are about 5 years in or so. So that might happen automatically for you anyway. So that's where you've got to consider what type of loan you're getting, what type of product you're getting, and speak to that mortgage broker or even just the bank in general. That's a good question. I'm going to throw 2 curveballs at you, Pete. And can you just give me like yes, no, or very short responses? So these are a bit of tongue in cheek, a bit of fun. David asks, thoughts on marina berths? I'm looking at one out the window here.
Marina berths, I think, yeah, for pleasure, but probably less so for investment, I guess.
Okay, I like it.
Short answer.
Carlos asked about car park lots. Thoughts? Car parks.
Yeah, it goes down into this becomes like a commercial investment, like a storage unit or a car. You'll generally find you don't get the same leverage. The yield might be quite good. Capital growth might be in line with inflation. So a bit like if you're buying a lock-up storage unit or something like that, you're not going to get a bank to lend you 90% for something like that. So, yeah, I mean, it's not to say it's a bad investment, but it doesn't have necessarily the same benefits as residential.
Okay. There was a question before, a good one from Yellow Cold. Any guidance on choosing between paying down your principal place of residence and investing in shares / ETFs? Obviously everyone's situation is different, Yellow Cold. But here's how I've taken this is I have an offset account attached to my principal place of residence. So I don't pay down the mortgage faster. I just put money in an offset account. That way I still have the flexibility. And if you don't have an offset account on your mortgage, you should speak to your bank. Go direct to them or even to your mortgage broker because they can negotiate that for you and it shouldn't cost you any extra. So we've got time for one more. This is more of I'm going to just give you this big curveball from Nick. This is a big question here, Pete. You've probably seen it in the chat already. You're probably smiling because of that. One of the biggest concerns right now is global debt levels. What do you think of the economy? People were calling for property to get crunched, central banks to get crunched, bad debts to spiral out of control. Australian property was going to collapse this year, according to the biggest forecasters on the front page of the AFR. What do you reckon?
Yeah, well, those forecasts haven't really come to pass. The economy is definitely cyclical. In fact, the government is out today. The forecast will show the economy will slow in 2024. I think, you can get very hung up on short-term property forecasts, which are nearly always wrong for various reasons. So if you're going to do property as an investment, to make it less stressful, try and think of it as a 10 or 20-year investment and worry a whole lot less about what happens next year. But yeah, I actually agree. We will see a rise in insolvencies next year and the economy will slow. I mean, that's more or less baked in at this point. So I tend to agree.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. A lot of the things that we hear in the media, sorry, I'm just looking over Sydney Harbour here and I just heard the boat go off. But a lot of the things that we do here in the media are very one-sided and what I would call first-level thinking. First-level thinking is the type of thinking that you can do when you're driving your car around a corner, like what am I going to have for dinner or I'm hungry. These are the types of thinking disciplines where you go interest rate up, property price down. It's never ever almost as simple as that. Sometimes there are things in life that should be simplified, but many things shouldn't. And property is, it's many properties in one big market. And so you got to buy right. Anyway, if you want to get in contact with Pete, you can use the form on the Rask website. I'll put the link in the chat. You don't, Rask doesn't make anything from this, just as an FYI. I'm just sharing it because Pete does a great job, and I know he doesn't talk about his services enough, but I wanted to do it for him. So you can go and speak to Pete, and you can book in a free chat with him if you just want to have a chat with him about property and strategy and all that sort of stuff. Pete, it's been a lot of fun, mate. I know you had to get up early for this, so on behalf of everyone in the chat tonight, I think we'll do it again next year. We'll be doing it again for the Australian Property Podcast. So really do thank you for your time tonight, mate.
Pleasure, thanks. And I'll just say there's probably half a dozen questions there on saving. And I think, look, so people even at the outset, they mentioned the big ticket items. Alcohol is expensive, separation, life gets in the way. I think if you follow, there's some great free resources out there. Ramit Sethi, he would talk about priorities, the big ticket items, cars, holidays, what's important to you, the 80-20 rule. In Australia, Dave Gow is a really good blog to follow, Strong Money Australia. Aussie Firebug, saving's such a big, important part in the early stage of the journey. And also, I saw a question there, what to do about renters and damage. Well, two things, screen your tenants and landlord insurance. Hopefully that covers that one.
Love it, mate. And Pete's book, Get a Financial Grip. I didn't mention this, guys. Pete's onto his 7th book. Get a Financial Grip was really influential for me in the early days. And I think you can still order it online. So go and check it out, as well as all the resources that Pete just mentioned. He's not just a property guy. We didn't even get to the shares and index funds. We didn't even get to how you basically became financially independent in your early 30s. We didn't get to all of those good things. So hopefully we'll have to have you back. Otherwise, you can hear more from Pete on Twitter or on the Australian Property Podcast. Once again, mate, thanks, and have a great day.
Pleasure. Thanks, Owen. Thanks, everyone.
And that was Pete Wargent. So the wonderful Pete Wargent, the great man himself. He's taught me so much over the many years that I've known Pete, and really lovely to have him on the show tonight. Thank you, everyone that did blow off your Christmas shopping to join us tonight. I still will carry on with my recommendation that the number one Christmas present you can get the person that you care for in your life is a Scrub Daddy sponge. Here it is. If you've used the Scrub Daddy sponge, you will know that it is, quite frankly, the most amazing sponge you could possibly get. Where are we? So you can see it. It looks like this. Here we go. We've got Mrs. Scrub Daddy there. Here we go. Look at this Scrub Daddy sponge. Get it for $4.50. You can save 10% if you subscribe to a recurring delivery of this soft but firm Scrub Daddy sponge. Just to clear something up here, a friend of mine, she bought the Scrub Daddy sponge after I mentioned it, said it changed her life. Then her partner started using it, and her partner works in a kitchen at a restaurant, and now he's bought the sponges for the entire kitchen at the restaurant. That's how good it is. So you can thank me later. There was a question from Benny. Hey, Owen, a while ago you said you might be on AusBiz on the 14th with Drew. Is this still happening? Also, thanks, Pete. You're a champion. He is a champion. Yes, tomorrow. Tomorrow I will be on AusBiz with David Kosh. So if you do tune into AusBiz online or on the tally, if you've got a smart TV, go to the AusBiz channel. I will be on from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. They've given me 10 stocks to review, and I'll be passing judgment on them, as well as Fortescue Metals. So that's tomorrow, AusBiz from 12 to 1. That's happening tomorrow. And finally, I've just got to recap a couple of things for y'all before I say good night. So my quote for this week is a quote from Charlie Munger from the AGM from 2022, and Kevin's shared this with me this week. It's so simple. You spend less than you earn, invest shrewdly, avoid toxic people and toxic activities, try to keep learning all your life, and do a lot of deferred gratification. If you do all of those things, you're almost certain to succeed. And this is from a guy that was a brilliant mind, sharp as ever, right into his 99th year. And basically, what he's suggesting is that life can be summed up with a few simple principles. And one thing that Charlie often says is do things that you would be proud of, have integrity. be ethical, these types of things in the way you react, be reliable, be consistent with your principles. Simple advice from a very smart and accomplished person. There were a lot of questions tonight about savings and these types of things, savings habits, savings hacks. You can go online and you can go to all of the Rask websites, but in particular our Rask Media website. And if you click on this and you go down the bottom, you will see this wonderful episode, and I'll bring this up and I'll put it in the chat. 24 ways to save and 24 ways to invest. This is out now. The Scrub Daddy Sponge, I don't think got a gig. Didn't get a Guernsey in this year's list, but every year for the past 4 years at Rask, we've done this thing, 24 ways to save and invest your money in 2024. Last year we had 23 ways to save and invest in 2023. And over on the property podcast this year, we've got a review of 2023. So we always do these around this time of Christmas. Good ways to save, good ways to make the most of your money over Christmas. So another way to save, if you haven't already, you can sign up to a brokerage platform like Selfwealth and get $9.50 trades. I think Rob from Selfwealth even would say that you might even get some trades for free when you join up. Okay, so I do see, where do I access Ausbiz? So the final thing, you can just go to Ausbiz online. I think it's ausbiz.co or ausbiz.com.au. Here we go, Deepak. It's online tomorrow. It should be there. Otherwise, you can get it on your smart TV. So you can go and check that out. And that's it for tonight. Goon, when are we going to talk about EFT? When you say EFT, I think you mean ETF. You can head over to that Rask Media site. There's heaps of information there on ETFs. But we will be back next week and talking about this. So the last thing, next week, I'll be back same time, 6 p.m. next Wednesday night, and you'll be stuck with me for an hour, and we're going to review 2023, and we're going to have a bit of fun as we look into 2024. Don't forget, you can get 50% off business books by going to the Major Street Publishing website and use the coupon code RASKXmas. Good Christmas presents. All right. Thank you, everyone, for the evening. Thank you so much. And to Pete once again. And we will see you next week, same time, same place, here on Rask Live. I'll see you then. Bye for now. I'll play a disclaimer just because I'm extra careful like this on the way out. Have a great night.